Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series. And in this one, I'm going over my round 2 game from the Open Portugal 2019, which took place in February. If you followed my first round game, you saw I got off to a good start with a win with black. And as this is an open tournament, you do have to kind of win the first few games down to give yourself the opportunity to play some of the top players a bit later on. So I was still playing down in the second round and was hoping to keep the good vibes going off of my first round win. My opponent here again was about 2200 and pretty good player. So every game is a challenge, and you really don't take any of these games where you play down for granted. So I was looking to really be pretty good in this one too. So I played d4. Luis played knight c6, and knight c6 is a very what can we say, offbeat line, almost inviting a Chigorin. So Chigorin normally goes c4, d5, and c takes d5, queen takes, and you might have like e3, e5, knight c3, bishop b4, and this type of position, Black's ultimately justifying the queen's position on d5 by saying, you know what, I have, I'm going to give up the bishop pair for it, but I'm gonna play very actively. And these positions can be kind of tricky, and especially if you've looked in them in a while. Some of the times with sidelines, you haven't looked at these positions in such a long time that you don't necessarily want to go down the off-beaten track, because it's probably something they know quite well. So because of that, I just decided to be a little bit rational and went for knight f3, which does not challenge the Chigorin in the most aggressive way, but just gets a position. So knight f3, d5, bishop f4, bishop g4, and e3. And again, this is not the most ambitious way to challenge the Chigorin, but I do think it gives white a promising position. Part of the reason for that is this knight on c6. In D4 openings, non-E4 openings, basically, normally we say the knight shouldn't be in front of the C pawn; it should be behind it. And so the reason for that is normally the action is happening on these 4 squares, and so normally you want your pawn to participate in that action. And because it's not, I kind of think the knight on c6 is a little bit misplaced. And so I was just trying to take advantage of that best way I could. So after bishop g4, e3, e6 was played, and now I went c4. And if you notice, now I'm going to get my knight behind the my c pawn, whereas black's is just in front of it. And so I think that promises white a tiny advantage. So c4, bishop d6, good move, trading off my active bishop on f4. I traded it. Queen takes d6, and now I went knight bd2. This was another idea I was thinking of, is now this pawn tension I think is a positive pawn tension for me, because if d takes c4, releasing it, I play knight takes c4, and my knight is very, very nice on this square. I thought it just looks really nice. It's stopping this e5 break, and I just think it's a nice position. And if queen b4 check, I can just go queen d2 and trade these queens. Note that a position like this, I don't think the double pawns here are a big problem, because I can go f4 and bishop g2 and play on this diagonal, and I just think white has a decent position. So d takes c4 didn't happen. Black played knight f6, and after knight f6 I went bishop e2, and again, this is not the most, dynamic way or challenging way for white to combat black's setup, but it is a little bit of a nagging edge. And I'm, for the time being, should be stopping e5, or so I thought. Black actually went e5, and I was really, really surprised, and I had to check the lines multiple times just to see, because I would thought by playing in this setup I was actually stopping e5. So I was like, wait, e5 shouldn't work here. Why is he playing e5? Why does e5 work? Does it work? Did I miss something? So I was just, all these thoughts were going through my head, and I was like, what happened here? And it turns out my calculation was correct, and I went for the critical d takes e5, which forks the queen and knight. And now knight takes e5 is forced. And now here, white has a nice little tactic to win a pawn. So pause the video for a moment, give it a thought, and I'll give you a few seconds. All right, so after knight takes e5, I have this really nice move, knight takes e5. So the point is that queen takes e5 is not possible because now I play bishop takes g4 and win a piece. So that's not possible. So black has to play bishop takes e2, hitting my queen. Fair enough. And now I have this very nice intermediate move, knight takes f7, which I played. And the point is that if you follow me and play bishop takes d1, I play knight takes d6 with check. And after c takes d6 and rook takes d1, white has a massive advantage. First of all, white is up a pawn. Second of all, white has 2 pawn islands, right? 2 pawn islands, and black has 3. And so I have a structural advantage. I'm a pawn up, and this would just be a matter of technique to convert. So very, very nice. After knight takes f7, black's just in trouble. Now, Louis pretty much made the most of it and played king takes f7, which I do believe is the best move given the circumstances. And after queen takes e2, I still have some technical problems to solve because my knight on d2 is a little bit misplaced here. And now black's rooks are actually connected before mine. So black springs into action, first with d4, good move, putting some pressure on my pawn. Note that I don't want to take on d4 like this because of rook e8 and I lose my queen. So I can't do that. So I actually play e4 to close the position. And now black has a potential protected pass pawn on d4, and it's just tricky to deal with. I mean, white should be winning this position. I have, 4 pawns on the king side versus 2, so I should slowly be able to mobilize my pawns. But black is playing as actively as possible to kind of keep me distracted. So d4 is a good move. I went e4, and now black went rook e8. Again, putting pressure here. Now, note, if I don't do anything, let's say I make a move like a3, I actually fall for a very nice knight takes e4 move. Point being that after knight takes e4, rook takes e4, queen takes e4, there's rook e8 catching my queen. So because that's a threat in the position, I have to reinforce the e4 pawn. And I do that by playing castles. Now, you might say, well, you just said you're going to reinforce the pawn. How does that reinforce anything? Well, the point is that I'm preparing to play f3 at some point or rook e1. And in the interim, knight takes e4 isn't possible because I can actually just take it now and I'm not pinned in the same way. So that's how I'm indirectly reinforcing the pawn because now rook takes e4, my king is not on e1, so there's no rook e8 at the end. So after castles, black went d3, pushing the pawn further, and I went queen e3. And again, I do have to be careful about this d-pawn. This d-pawn is, theoretically the strongest pawn on the board because it's the closest to queening. So I have to, the success of this position hinges on my ability to control and blockade that d-pawn. And I was keenly aware that, black is, doing the best they can given the circumstances. So black went rook a d8. Good move. I think centralizing rooks, trying to get some more activity. And you note the a7 pawn is hanging, but it looked very risky to go after it. Because, again, my e4 pawn might hang. The d2 pawn might get active. I didn't want to break that blockade. So I actually went for rook a e1, protecting the e4 pawn and thinking about winning the a5 pawn. Rook a1 is not the best move, I think. In hindsight, it probably would have been better to just go f3 because it reinforced the pawn like this and it dominates the knight. Now the knight doesn't have a lot of mobility, so probably a better decision to go that route. I went rook a e1, and then black went king g8, bring the king out the way. And now I actually went f3. And now you can actually clearly see, okay, well, if you're going to go f3 all along. Why did you bring the rook to e1? Well, I was thinking about actually going f4, but once the king moved away to g8, I kind of wanted to change plans. So f3, queen b4, and now I actually went rook b1 back because I didn't want to create a weakness on the queen side. I thought that if I played a move like b3, now black has some squares, dark squares to play with, and I didn't want to allow that. So I thought rook b1 was a little bit more smart. Black played a5, trying to take some space on the queen side. And note that, I'm really doing a great job of blockading this pawn right now and making sure this knight doesn't have any entry squares. If this knight gets any entry squares, I might have a problem. So very important that I'm just keeping that under control. After a5, I went for a3. Again, now I still have these squares covered, so it's not a problem that I'm pushing the a pawn. And now queen e7 back, and this is a small victory for me because the skirmish on the queen side didn't lead to anything just yet. The queen did not get in and invade any of my squares, so I'm happy. Note that if queen a4 was played, I was thinking about playing a move like rook fc1 and getting my rook to c3, covering the c2 square, eyeing the d3 pawn, yada yada. So queen e7, rook fd1, and now that I've pushed the queen back, I want to kind of just hammer down on the d3 pawn. Rook d7 was played, and I actually think rook d7 is probably the decisive mistake. The reason for that is my next move. So if you want to pause the video for a second and figure out why rook d7 is very bad, but why I'm able to, it's just a little bit out of place there on d7, go for it. All right, so the reason rook d7 is a mistake is because of this move, knight b3. And the point is not only am I attacking the a5 pawn, I'm also threatening knight c5 with tempo, which also attacks the b7 pawn and the d3 pawn. So all these, squares now can't be covered. And again, if you play b6, the d3 pawn is also hanging, so I can also even take it like that. So very, very tough position, and just losing, actually. Black played rook ed8, covering the d3 pawn, and now instead of going after the a5 pawn, I played knight c5 because I saw that attacking the rook meant that if I take on b7, I'm also attacking a5. So just this knight is just moving around like a carousel into new targets, black can't hold them all. So after knight c5, black actually went rook d4, and I just played knight takes b7, and now I'm 2 pawns up. I'm 2 pawns up, and I've managed, the d3 pawn is not a problem yet, so I'm good. Black kind of saw the writing on the wall and went for, black actually went for d2 here, giving up the exchange and trying to sort of hammer the d pawn home. I think the problem is if you move the rook here, and you want to stay on the file to protect the d4 rook. If you go rook d7, again, I can just go knight takes a5, and I'm 3 pawns up, and I'm threatening knight c6. So just a huge problem. So after d2, I said, you know what, I want that exchange. Yes, please, I'll take it. And after queen takes d8, my only question was, how do I make sure the rook on b1 gets in the game to secure this d2 pawn? Because I cannot win the pawn without the rook. And I don't really want my king on f1 to come to e2 to secure the pawn. So really, it was just how do I secure the d2 pawn? And how many moves does it take for this knight on f6 to get in the game? And you could see the knight on f6, it takes at least 3 moves to get to a meaningful square. So I was not really concerned about the f6 knight. So because of those factors, I went for b3. Just, saying, you know what, I'm going to go rook b2, rook takes d2, and everything will be secured. Rook d3 is played, challenging my queen. I went queen f2, keeping it on this diagonal so there was no queen d4 check, and still eyeing the d2 pawn. And after queen f2, seeing that my next move was pretty much rook b2 against almost anything, my opponent resigned because the pawn in d2 is going to be lost. I'm going to be in exchange up with multiple pawns, and my king on g1 is completely safe. So, pretty clean game. I was kind of happy with it. Just developed my pieces, got them to good squares, and you kind of could see how the knight on c6 and the Chigorin is kind of, can be a problem piece to a certain extent because it's in the way of black's c-pawn. Note that even in this final position, the c-pawn on c7 never actually moved. And you think, wow, this c-pawn would have loved to get in the game, influence the center. Because again, in a lot of the d4, c4 openings, these 4 squares in the middle are the most important squares. So keep those things in mind. All right. Thanks for watching. Please like the video and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by checking out the description below. Thanks. Take care.